All right. Again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your time, your interest, and support. And with that, I'll pass the floor to Nathaniel.
Great. Thank you so much, Ren. And for those of you who came in a little bit late, the person who just introduced me is Ren Siniza. She's our amazing organizing associate. If you have ever been to a postcarding training or a phone calling training, or just asked a question about volunteering for EVP, you have interacted with Ren and you know how awesome she is. I am Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, and I am so happy that all of you have chosen to join us tonight to learn about low propensity environmental voters on Long Island. And before we get started, I do feel like I need to explain this background of mine. I am on the coast of Maine right now, and this shack is the only place where we get good internet service. So I promise I'm not like in a hostage video. Someone asked me earlier today if it was a saved background. No, it's not. But that's why there's this weird background there. I am going to start by sharing my screen here. And what you'll see is, first, I just want to go over what you can expect this evening. So I'm going to start by providing a very quick introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who are brand new to EVP, you will get a very quick overview of what we do, but only a quick overview of what we do. So if you're looking for a much more in-depth introduction to our work, don't worry, we're going to supply a lot of links to places where you can get that in-depth introduction to our work in the chat. Then we will get into our Long Island voter data briefing. So in the first part, the quick intro, we'll go over what we do, why we do it, how we do it, and some of our results. Then we're going to dive into all of these non-voting environmentalists that we've identified in Long Island, who they are, what they're like, where they're located. And then 3, we'll go over some of the voter mobilization opportunities that our nonprofit, the Environmental Voter Project, is providing this fall and then into next year. And then finally, as Ren mentioned at the beginning, we will have time for a Q&A session. So if you have questions as we go along, please put them in that Q&A folder at the bottom of your screen. Ren will answer some of them. Others she won't answer for you because she's holding them. She's holding them for later for this Q&A session. So if she hasn't answered your question, just know that that's probably why. All right. One final thing before we get started, and that is I just want to thank a few people. I know that Daniel Stein has done some great outreach, getting a lot of people to show up to this evening. So have all the folks at Markers for Democracy, and in particular, Ellen Bender, and a whole lot of other local organizations have been doing outreach, getting people who might be interested in our work to attend tonight. And I just want to thank all of you for doing that. And I want to thank all of you who are here tonight. We have a huge crowd. And so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. In a nutshell, what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is just 2 things. 1, identify environmentalists who don't vote, and 2, turn them into better voters. That's it. That's it. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is just laser focused on those 2 things, identifying environmentalists who don't vote and then turning them into better voters. And so what that also means is that we don't do a lot of stuff that many other environmental nonprofits do. And I think it's useful to go over these things. We do not endorse candidates. That's important, but we don't do it. We do not lobby for particular policies. That's also important, but we don't do it. We don't even, as weird as this might sound, we don't even try to convince people to care more about climate change or other environmental issues. In fact, a good way to think about the Environmental Voter Project is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. What we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we try to bypass all the hard, messy, expensive stuff of politics, which is changing people's opinions and getting them to care about stuff that they don't care about. We want to bypass all that hard stuff and instead go to the people who are already with us. They don't need to be convinced that climate change is important. They're just not voting. These are the people who need a purely behavioral intervention. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not. But what it is easier and cheaper than changing people's opinions. Because I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that we live at a moment in time where it's become increasingly hard to change people's minds about anything, especially climate and environmental issues. So what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is skip all those people who need their opinions changed. Other groups can do that stuff. We focus on the people who are already with us. They are dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who care so much about climate and the environment that it's actually their number one priority over all other issues. Yet, they aren't voting. And what we then do is run year-round voter mobilization campaigns focused just on those people. And part of the reason we have this laser focus is because it turns out there are huge numbers of these non-voting environmentalists. Just last fall in the 2022 midterms, over 13 million already registered to vote people who list climate or the environment as their number one priority just stayed home and didn't cast a ballot on election day. Over 13 million of them. Over 8 million Environment First registered voters skipped the 2020 presidential election. They're already registered to vote. And although you might be shaking your head in frustration, believe me, we do this sometimes too, thinking like, oh my gosh, why aren't all these people who care so deeply about climate and other environmental issues, like why aren't they voting? What I'd like to suggest to you over the next 10, 15 minutes is that yes, it is really frustrating that all these environmentalists aren't voting, but it's also an enormous opportunity. Because remember what I was just saying about how hard and expensive it is to change people's minds. Well, these people don't need their minds changed. They are already with us. They just need to get their butts out the door on election day. And what's special about that particular problem is that because of the public nature of the voter file, we can run experiments and figure out precisely which messages work best to turn non-voters into voters, and then iterate on those messages and fine-tune them and optimize our messaging just focused on this one thing. And at the Environmental Voter Project, we've gotten really good at identifying these non-voting environmentalists and then turning them into consistent voters. And although I still want to spend a few more minutes introducing you to what we do and why and how at the Environmental Voter Project, I'll go ahead and just spoil the surprise for you. You might think these numbers are big nationally. Just wait till I show you the numbers for Long Island. The reason we at the Environmental Voter Project are working in Long Island is that there are disproportionately large, I mean, we're talking about enormous populations of already registered to vote super environmentalists who don't cast their ballots. This is an enormous opportunity for the environmental movement and for the broader progressive movement writ large. All right, so this is what we focus on at the Environmental Voter Project. And numbers like the ones that you see here are why we think this is such an enormous opportunity. All right, so how do we find these numbers? Where are we pulling these numbers? Are we just getting them out of midair? No. What we do is we have a very precise way of identifying who these non-voting environmentalists are across the country, but also in particular jurisdictions like in Long Island. And what that is it's the first step in this 4-step process that I'm about to go through. These are the 4 steps that make up what we do with the Environmental Voter Project. So the first is identification. And forgive me, I'm going to go through these 4 steps pretty quickly, because remember, we have a lot of data to get through. And what this is not is a full like hour-long introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. So me if I go a little quickly here. If you have questions about this stuff, I promise you I will absolutely get to them in the Q&A. So first step, identification. We work with data scientists to build predictive models on voter files to individually identify these super environmentalists. Any of you who have ever worked on big political campaigns are probably used to these predictive models. But for those of you who aren't, I'm very briefly going to explain how they're made. We start by polling enormous numbers of people. If your typical political poll has 400 or 600 people, well, we're almost 15 or 20 times as large as that. We will poll 10 or 15 or 20,000 people. And we only ask them one question, and that is, what's your number one most important political priority? We can then isolate the people in, say, New York State, who tell us that climate change or clean air or clean water are their number one priority. And let's say, I'm just making up this number, but let's say 1,000 people in New York tell us that climate or other environmental issues are their number one priority. Well, then what we can do is with these data scientists say, okay, what do we know about these 1,000 people who just told us climate's their number one priority? What voter file data is there? What census data is there? What publicly available behavioral and consumer data is there? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of rich data out there. And what that allows us to then do is find other people in New York who might share those collections of attributes. We start looking for these hidden patterns and correlations to help us find other people who have a high likelihood of listing climate and the environment as their top priority. And it's a long iterative process, but at the end of it, what we are able to do is test and retest and refine these models and literally assign a score from 0 to 100 to every single individual voter in, say, the New York State voter file, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and environmental issues, but literally list them as their number one priority over all other issues. And these are frighteningly accurate. Now, I know I just breezed over a pretty complex topic. And again, if you have questions, please ask them in the Q&A folder and I'll get to them in the Q&A session. But I'll just put a button on this first step by saying, when we finish building these predictive models with our data scientists, we say, okay, thank you very much. You've told us that these are really accurate, but now we're going to go to one of your competitors and we're going to give them the top 15% scores in this model you've just built for us, people who score an 85 and up. And we're going to ask them to poll these people and ask them an open-ended question. Just ask them, hey, what's your number one most important political priority? Every time we've done that, at least 85% of the respondents have replied off the top of their heads, oh, climate change, why do you ask? That's how precise these predictive models are. And I don't say that to prove to you that we're particularly good or bad at this. We're not. It has nothing to do with us. This is just how sophisticated this targeting technique is. And it's the same technique that sophisticated presidential and Senate and gubernatorial campaigns use to target voters. All right, let's move to part 2, to step 2. Once we've identified these individuals on voter files who have a very high likelihood of listing climate and the environment as their number one priority, yet we know from public voting histories that they don't vote, well then, we can now message to these people however we want, right? Like, we could be completely agnostic with our messaging. We don't even need to talk about climate change because we know these people, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate. We just want to turn them into better voters. And if talking about chocolate chip cookies is the best way to do it, we will talk about chocolate chip cookies. And so what we do in the second step, the mobilization step, is we have thousands. At last count, we had over 6,000 volunteers around the country who help us canvass and call and send postcards to these voters. We as a staff also do direct mail and digital ad campaigns to them. And we run dozens of randomized control trials each year simply to help us optimize which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to do one thing, and that is just turn them into better voters. And so this is the behavioral science aspect of what we do. If step one is the data science, where we identify these low propensity environmental voters, step two is the behavioral science. We simply test which messages work best at turning these voters from non-voters into new voters and new voters into consistent voters. And if you go to the results tab on our website, you can see well over a dozen studies going over which messages we found over which communications channels work best at turning non-voters into new voters and new voters into consistent voters. All right, then we go to step three, habit reinforcement. You don't need to be a behavioral scientist to intuitively understand that if you're trying to change people's habits, like their voting habits, you can't just talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. That's not how you change habits. If you were trying to eat healthy, would you only talk to a dietitian once every 2 years? If you were trying to exercise more often, would you only go to the gym once every 2 years? No. And if you're trying to turn people into habitual voters, habit reinforcement is so crucially important. And so what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we talk to these low propensity environmental voters whenever they have an election. Federal, state, local, we will talk to these voters for library trustee races. I'm serious. Not because library trustee races have anything to do with environmental policymaking, but because they have everything to do with creating habitual, consistent voters. We truly view every election as a precious behavioral intervention opportunity. And so just in this year alone, 2023 alone, I think we've already been active in 127 different elections in the 19 states that we work in. And then finally, the fourth step, changing the electorate. Ultimately, what we hope to achieve is, yes, maybe we will help particular candidates win particular elections, but that's not our ultimate goal. Our ultimate goal is to dramatically increase the number of environmentalists who vote. Not the ones who don't vote, but the ones who do vote. Because whether you vote or not is public record. And even in this hyper-partisan time that we live in, there is still one thing that unites all Democrats and Republicans. And that is, boy, do they all like winning elections. Nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so what they do is they go where the votes are. Politicians go where the votes are. If they don't, they ain't going to be a politician for much longer. It's the brutal arithmetic of how democracy works. Either you go where the votes are, or you don't get to be a politician. And so what our goal is at the Environmental Voter Project is year after year, having a cumulative impact on the electorate so that after time, nobody can run for anything on Long Island without thinking, holy moly, where did all these environmental voters come from? I better pay attention to what their priorities are, or I ain't going to be a politician much longer. That is our goal. Increasing voter demand for environmental leadership. All right, these are the 19 states that we work in. The 2 states in yellow, Nebraska and Louisiana, we just expanded into earlier this year, but these are the 19 states that we do this work in year in, year out. If you would like more information about our work, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/about. Forgive me for moving quickly, but I do want to get into our results at EVP and then our Long Island data and voter mobilization opportunities, and still leave room for the Q&A session at the end. All right, so I've just explained to you what we do with the Environmental Voter Project, why we do it, and how we do it. Here are some of our results before I get to our Long Island data. Just last year in 2022, when we were still in 17 states and not 19, we ended up contacting over 2.3 million individual environmental voters. We sent direct mail, digital ads, we had door-to-door canvassing, we had phone calls, and we had volunteer postcards. All with this behavioral science-informed messaging that we had tested in randomized control trials so that we knew it would increase turnout. And we measure our impact in two ways. First, we measure our impact in what's called randomized control trials. And very, very briefly, what this is let's say we identify 1 million unlikely to vote environmentalists in the state of New York. What we do not do is immediately start messaging to all 1 million of them. Instead, before we start talking to a single one, we randomly set aside about 15 or 20% of them, about 200,000, in a control group, and we never talk to them. Then the remaining 80 to 85%, they're the ones who we call and canvass and send postcards and direct mail and digital ads to. Then the election happens. Then we've got to wait a bit. But a few months after the election, public voter files are updated. And as many of you know, who you vote for is secret. We never can figure that out. But whether you vote or not is public record. And so when voter files are updated, what that allows us to do is measure what turnout was in our control group of low propensity environmental voters, and then compare it to turnout in our treatment group, that 80 to 85% that we actually communicated with. And what these randomized controlled trials allow us to do is isolate what our impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. Because even if some presidential campaign spent $1 billion in our state mobilizing voters, well, we've controlled for that with this random separation process. Unless the Biden campaign hacked into our system and decided to only talk to people at our treatment group, we have controlled for that. And what this allows us to do is isolate our impact on turnout. And just over the last 4 years, we have been able to increase turnout in general elections, primary elections, and local elections by some pretty significant numbers. This is what we did in 2020. This is what we did in 2021. This in 2022. And this year, we're starting to get some data back in. And just in Nebraska and Kansas and Georgia, we already have data showing that we had statistically significant increases in turnout. So what do these numbers mean? If you see an increase of 1.8 percentage points in a Pennsylvania general election, what that means is we, the Environmental Voter Project, were solely responsible for increasing turnout among the low propensity environmental voters we contacted by 1.8 percentage points in comparison to our control group. That might not sound like a big number to some of you, but that is everything in this business. Ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.8% is in Pennsylvania. He'll tell you. These are some big, big numbers. And as you can see, in lower turnout elections like primaries and local elections, we get even bigger results. Moreover, there are hundreds of elections where we're targeting such small numbers of people, we can't get statistically significant results in randomized control trials, because we do believe in that habit reinforcement, like I told you, and there's no way to measure precisely what our impact is in like these little library trustee races. But that gets us to our second metric. Cumulatively, Since we launched our proof of concept in one state just 7 years ago, we have now communicated with 9.5 million individual low propensity environmental voters, and we've tracked them all on the voter file. And as of last March, almost 1.5 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. These 1.5 million environmental voters, who by definition were pretty awful voters or we wouldn't be talking to them, were now super voters, who even if you are voting in a Suffolk County legislative election, or even if you were running a campaign, you would look and you'd say, oh my gosh, these environmentalists are going to vote. Now, to be clear about this second metric, of which we are very proud, this doesn't have the same scientific rigor as the first metric, the randomized control trials. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible. We've now mobilized voters in over 1,900 elections in these states. No one else is doing this year-round work in really dinky elections, just trying to build good voting habits. All right. If you want more information on our results, please go to environmentalvoter.org/results. You have all been very, very patient. Let's get to some Long Island data, okay? Why is the Environmental Voter Project in New York, but especially Long Island? Why do we care so much about Long Island? Well, a few things. First of all, there are huge numbers of non-voting and seldom voting environmentalists in Long Island who are already registered. They're already registered to vote. They're just not casting ballots. Two, no matter how smart we are, no matter how much we learn from all these randomized control trials we run, the truth is repetition is the best tool we've got. And another thing that we love about New York and Long Island as well, obviously, is that you have multiple elections in odd years, not just even years. So we're always getting bites at the apple to talk to these voters. There's always an obvious opportunity to mobilize them. You also in Long Island, you don't need me to tell you, I know there are a lot of Long Islanders on here, at the local, state, and federal level, you've now got a lot of really, really competitive elections. And then finally, this is a region of the state and of the country with really high levels of concern about water quality, extreme weather, and sea level rise and other environmental issues. And so looking at these predictive models that I told you about before, looking at these models that we've built where we've identified all of these super environmentalists and then cross-referenced them with voting histories, this is what we found in Suffolk and Nassau counties combined. 94,532 registered voters who are extremely likely to list climate and the environment as their top priority, yet they've never voted in a presidential election, and so are unlikely to vote in the upcoming one next year. 94,000. Looking at just this fall, looking at these super environmentalists who are registered to vote, yet skip odd year general elections. I know many of you are focused on the upcoming county legislative elections. We've identified just in these two counties, 237,103 already registered super environmentalists who have never voted in an odd year general election in Suffolk or Nassau. That is a huge, huge pool of potential political power. And just to provide some context, this is how many registered voters there are on Long Island. How many Long Island voters showed up and cast ballots in the 2020 presidential and in the most recent odd year general election. Now, I know that the 2021 general election on Long Island was different from the one now because different counties had different competitive elections, but still that 237,000 is a big honking number. All right, who are these people? What do we know about these 237,000 super environmentalists in Suffolk and Nassau counties who are registered but unlikely to vote this fall, unless they get some really good interventions from groups like us and people like you? Well, I'd like you to look at this chart on the bottom. First, let me just explain what you're looking at here. At the very bottom, these are the numbers for all registered voters in Suffolk and Nassau counties. So, for instance, 8.7% of registered voters in Suffolk and Nassau are between 18 and 24 years old. Then this line above it are the Environmental Voter Project targets. So these are people who are also registered to vote. So they're a subset of this lower row, but they are super environmentalists who have a history of not voting in these odd year general elections. So what can we see? Well, the first thing is they're disproportionately young, right? Probably not a surprise. People who tend to care deeply about climate and the environment do tend to be younger. But the interesting thing is, if I showed you this data for other parts of New York or for other parts of the country, you would actually see even higher numbers, even higher percentages of young people. So actually on Long Island, these low propensity environmental voters are older than what we see in other areas. In fact, especially in these 35 to 64 range, normally we don't see percentages that high. I know those numbers look low, but they are much, much higher than we see elsewhere. You'll also note this bump when it gets to people over the age of 65. We do see that elsewhere. We see that all over the country. Don't let anybody tell you that it's as simple as the older you get, the less likely you are to care deeply about climate and the environment. No, we don't see that. We consistently see that people in this 35 to 64-year-old range don't care that much about the environment, or at least far fewer of them do. But these people 65 and up, they are much, much more likely to care deeply about climate and the environment than middle-aged folks are. All right, when we look at sex data, boy, is there a huge gender gap. I mean, there's a small gender gap just among all registered voters. You see, there are 6% more female registered voters than male registered voters on Long Island. But that 6% gap grows to a 17 or almost 18 percentage point gender gap when we're looking at these low propensity environmental voters. So on Long Island, these low propensity environmental voters are disproportionately young and disproportionately female. When we look at race, they are a little less likely to be white. But what's interesting is what racial groups are driving that. It is not from Black and Hispanic voters. In fact, Black and Hispanic voters are underrepresented in our target population, which, by the way, is not the case elsewhere in New York or elsewhere in the country. In almost every state in the country, Black voters are overrepresented. They are disproportionately represented in our target populations. Hispanic voters, it varies from state to state. But look at this. Asian American and Pacific Islanders are 3 times as prevalent in this target population of ours on Long Island, these low propensity environmental voters, than they are in the overall electorate on Long Island. That's just a huge data point that just screams out at us. Now, we do see that AAPI voters are much more likely to care deeply about climate and the environment, and also have be less likely to vote. So this is something we see in other states, but it is rarely this strong. It is rarely this prevalent. Maybe in the Atlanta suburbs, we see really disproportionate numbers like this. But Long Island, it blows pretty much all the other places away with this really strong prevalence of AAPI, low propensity environmental voters. All right. What we can also notice is that, yes, Long Island is a very wealthy area. There is a very, very high percentage of registered voters in Long Island who make more than $100,000 a year. But the environmentalists, there are fewer of them who make over 100 grand a year. And when we start to factor in vote propensity, So this second data set here, if we look at all registered voters who skip odd year general elections, 53.4% of them make over 100 grand a year. But when we look at environmentalists who we're targeting this fall, it's fewer than 40%. And then next year, when we look at presidential elections, all registered voters on Long Island who skip presidentials, about a third of them make over 100 grand a year. Environmentalists who skip presidentials on Long Island, less than a quarter. So this fills out our demographic overview of who these low propensity environmental voters are on Long Island. They are disproportionately young. They are disproportionately female. They are disproportionately Asian American and Pacific Islander. And they are, I don't want to say disproportionately lower income, but they are lower income than the baseline of registered voters. That's who these low propensity environmental voters are in Long Island. Where are we, or where are they rather? Here are the 237,103 already registered to vote super environmentalists in Suffolk and Nassau counties who typically skip odd year general elections. Not to be creepy, but like we literally know these people by name and street address. This is what we get from those predictive models that we build. And this is how we are able to individually target them with this behavioral science informed messaging. And so moving into the next few months, oh, I'm sorry, before we get into the next few months, I also wanted to just do a rundown on congressional districts. I know all of you have this fall's county legislative elections on the brain, but you're also thinking about the congressional races. So this is the data of of environmentalists who we're targeting this fall because they're unlikely to vote this fall. Next year, we will be targeting a smaller population of people because we only want to target people who are unlikely to vote in that particular election. We don't want to waste your time or our donors' time sending voter mobilization messaging to people next year who already vote in presidential elections. So no, we right size our universe next year and it will be smaller. Looking in the 4 congressional districts that have Long Island in them, and I know that three in particular has some that aren't Suffolk and Nassau County. This is how our targets break down. So the 1st congressional district, for those of you who aren't familiar with Long Island, this is the 1st congressional district here, represented by a Republican. In fact, I'll just save time. All 4 of these districts are represented by Republicans. It is an R+3 district. What this means is all else being equal compared to the national average in presidential and midterm years, the Cook Political Report says this district trends 3 points Republican. The Environmental Voter Project has already identified almost 30,000 registered to vote super environmentalists in that 1st congressional district who have never voted in a presidential election. These are the people we'll be contacting next year throughout the entire year for primaries, for local elections. Every election we will be using as a behavioral intervention opportunity. In the 2nd congressional district, you'll see it's also R+3. We have fewer targets there. For those of you who are familiar with Long Island, that might not surprise you. The 3rd congressional district. You've probably heard a few news stories about the 3rd congressional district. You don't need me to go into that. Certainly it's going to be an election that folks are paying attention to. Although it's represented by George Santos, a Republican, it actually is a D+2 district. So it is 2 points more Democratic trending than the average congressional district in the country. And look at that. Holy moly, we have over 32,000 super environmentalists there who are unlikely to vote in presidential elections who we've already identified. And almost 23,000 in the 4th congressional district. As we look ahead to next year, these are the targets we've already identified. Now we'll probably be adding some targets to this list because we'll probably refresh our predictive models to sweep in people who are registering to vote for the first time next year. So this is who we're targeting this year. This is who we are targeting next year. And as we roll into the next few months, I want to just lay out some of the voter mobilization opportunities that we'll be making available to you. The first is, obviously, we have this briefing tonight. Boy, do we want you to sign up to mobilize these voters we've identified. You can go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved. The link will be in the chat. You can click on it and sign up to vote, or sign up to volunteer rather. What we'll also be doing is tomorrow we'll be emailing you a recording of this video. Please share it with people in your groups, share it with friends of yours who might be interested, share it on social media. And then you can already sign up for phone banks that we have scheduled for a few upcoming elections. As some of you on this call probably know, Assembly District 27, so New York Assembly District 27 has an election coming up. I believe it's on September 12th. But a week before then, we already have up on our website a link where you can sign up to volunteer to phone bank the voters we have identified in that state Assembly District 27, who are super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. We will provide you with the scripts that you need. We will provide you with the training at the beginning of the phone bank, and we will be mobilizing those voters. You can also already sign up for a phone bank on September 20th. This will be the first of our phone banks into Suffolk County from September 20th all the way through November 7th. And we will be putting more up on our website, but I encourage you to already just go to that link and sign up to volunteer. You'll come to a Zoom webinar just like this. It'll actually be a meeting. You can see each other. Someone like Ren or one of our volunteers will train you. You'll get on the phone and you'll be using these proven messages. We know from randomized control trials, they work at increasing turnout, and you can start mobilizing these low propensity environmental voters in Suffolk County to vote in the upcoming general election. Once you have been to one of those trainings, you will then get the keys to the kingdom. You will be on an email list, and every week we will email you links such that you can call on your own whenever you want to mobilize these voters for us. We will give you that script. We will give you the numbers, and you can do it on your own. That being said, we will put more of these phone banks to Suffolk County up on our website. Moreover, if you have a group where you want to have your own special phone bank, you want to either meet in person or meet over Zoom, as long as you think you can get at least 15 attendees, we will specially schedule a phone bank just for you. We will train you. We'll have the trainer on the entire time, and you guys can drink wine and call voters. We will be doing stuff like that all the way through November 7th. The one caveat is, once we get into the last 5 days before the general election, we at EVP will no longer be scheduling phone banks for specific elections. Instead, we will be scheduling phone bank shifts, multiple shifts each day. And then we ask that you let us put you on whatever election we think is most needing your time and effort. But you can still, on your own, call into Suffolk County. But don't worry, we will be putting lots of efforts during those last 5 days towards Suffolk County. All right, we've got 15 minutes left. I want to get to your questions, but I'll just close by saying, please, if our work at the Environmental Voter Project is of interest to you, I ask you to do one of 3 things, or maybe all 3 things. The first, go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved. and sign up to volunteer. Sign up for that Assembly District 27 or that Suffolk County phone bank. 2, if you're not the kind of person who likes to volunteer, or if you like to volunteer but you like to do something extra, please donate to support our work. There will be a link in the chat. You can click on it and make a donation. We had almost 10,000 different donations last year, or different donors last year. We are grassroots funded. And we're still looking to raise $85,000 more just for our Suffolk County, New York campaigns this fall, because we're going to be doing a lot of direct mail to mobilize these low propensity environmental voters too. And if you donate tonight, it will go towards those Suffolk County efforts. So please, please make a generous donation. And then the final thing is, if you are interested in maybe hosting a webinar like this for some of your friends, or hosting a phone bank for your group, please email us at info@environmentalvoter.org so we can work with you to set up a special event for your group, either to learn about what I just discussed now or to have one of these phone banks. All right. Thank you for your patience. I hope you have your questions in the Q&A, and I am really, really excited to answer them. So Ren, what do we got? We got any questions here?
Yes, we do. First things first, we just want to say thank you so much for placing your questions in the Q&A. We really appreciate it. We have 2 to 3 questions. So the first one is from Rob. How do you choose the states in which EVP is operating?
Really, really great question, Rob. And so I just stopped sharing my screen, but I'm going to go back to doing it. Ren, can you see the slides? Is that sharing properly?
Yes.
Great. So Rob, I just want people to be able to see the states as I describe them. So how do we choose these 19 states? There are a few criteria. The first, most important criteria is, where are there disproportionately large populations of non-voting environmentalists? We need to have a target-rich environment, because no matter how good we are at turning non-voters into new voters, you know, if there are only like 20 non-voting environmentalists in, say, Idaho, well, who cares if we turn them all into voters? Like, that's not going to do anything. That's not going to change any environmental policy making at the federal, state, or local level. So the first thing is, we need huge, disproportionately large populations of these non-voting environmentalists. And so you'll recognize that although a lot of the states that we work in are purple states, not all of the very politically important sort of swing states are places where we work. Like, we don't work in Wisconsin. I would never claim that Wisconsin is a politically unimportant state. Of course, it's a politically important state, but it is also a state that doesn't have that many non-voting environmentalists. And it's crucially important to us at EVP to always be able to be honest with our donors and our volunteers that their time and effort and their donations have a really high return on investment. We know that you spend your volunteer time with lots of different groups, and we don't want to try to persuade you to contact voters in Wisconsin with us when we know your time talking to Wisconsin voters would be better spent with another group. But in these 19 states that you see here, oh boy, I mean, there are such enormous numbers of non-voting environmentalists that we can guarantee you that your work with us will have a huge, huge impact on environmental policy making and environmental politics. So that's the first criteria. The second criteria is something I alluded to earlier, which is one of the other things that we really like about Long Island. And that is places that have active election calendars, not just in even years, but in odd years. So for instance, Oregon is a state that has lots of non-voting environmentalists, but we don't vote in Oregon because they don't have odd year elections. For very good government reasons, they have decided to change all of their local elections to coincide with their big even year federal and state elections. And there's a good public policy reason for that. It gets more people to choose their city councilors and their mayors, but that's bad news for people in the behavior changing business, because that means we get fewer bites at the apple. So Rob, that's the second criteria that we use to choose states. And then the third criteria is, remember, we are working year-round in federal, state, and local elections. And so we also care deeply about changing climate and environmental policy, not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level. Many of you Long Islanders don't need me to tell you that you're dealing with some pretty serious local water quality issues right now. Well, that is a serious policy problem that you need more political power to help solve. And so we aren't just interested in the states where, a really big Senate race is happening. We're interested in states where if you change the number of environmentalists who vote, you can make really, really big strides with state policymaking and local policymaking as well. So those are the three criteria, Rob, for why we work in these 19 states. Lots of non-voting environmentalists, lots of elections, and the ability to change policy at all levels of government.
Thanks for that, Daniel. Second is from Daniel. It's a 3-part question. So the first question, it was asked during the EVP result data section. Could you please clarify if the percentage increase measured against the environmental cohort you've identified or the total voting population? And can I ask the second question?
Yeah, go through all three.
Does the R+3 estimate for New York District 1 take into account for that is a new district, having recently integrated Huntington Township which skews more Democratic? How do you estimate take into account redistricting in general? And lastly, this one is how can we integrate the lessons learned about messaging into other local outreach, such as scripts for canvassing for legislator candidates?
Really, really great questions, Daniel. And so I'll take them in order. First, yes, I'm glad you asked that clarifying question on our randomized control trial data in case people were interested. When we say we increase turnout among low propensity environmental voters 1.8 percentage points versus our control group, that does not mean that we increase turnout in the entire state 1.8 percentage points. It is just among these low propensity environmental voters who we are targeting. And so that is what that is measuring. But in some of these states, that's enormous. I mean, just to give you an example, I think last year for the midterms, we were targeting over 700,000 low propensity environmental voters in Pennsylvania. These numbers are huge. These numbers are huge. But yes, that does not mean that we increased statewide turnout of all voters 1.8 percentage points. It's just looking at these low propensity environmental voters in comparison to the low propensity environmental voters in our control group. All right, to get to your second question, those partisan lean numbers, which were put together by the Cook Political Report, are for the new congressional districts. So yes, they do take into account Huntington being in the new district and things like that. These are for the new districts. That is their predicted partisan lean, looking at previous elections, but the votes that were cast by people in the new districts, if that makes sense. So they're not combining numbers from the old first congressional district and the new first congressional district. Instead, they're looking at the people who are in the new first congressional district, and they're looking at the elections that those people were able to vote on and going back through time to build those partisan leans. So that R+3 is a partisan lean number for the new district. And then the third part of your question, how can you integrate and other groups integrate some of the messaging? Well, the types of messaging that you can use depend on what your goals are. If you are trying to change people's minds and get them to vote for a particular candidate or vote for a particular issue, it's a different type of messaging than if you are doing just pure behavior change messaging like ours. Because we only have a few minutes left, I won't get into a lot of the behavioral science that we use, but what I will say is, Ren, could you in the chat share the reports link? What people can do is you can look in the chat at this link at the reports that we've published. And in many of them, you can see the precise wording and precise design that we have used. So you can see the messaging, the wording that we use for phone banks, the wording that we use for direct mail, the wording that we use for digital ads. You can see the precise stuff that we use and the results that we have gotten that led to these increases in turnout. And we are happy to publish those results. And if there are any groups that have questions about how this might relate to campaigns that you are running, we are more than happy to hop on the line with you and give you some advice. Now, I want to be clear, we can't advise partisan candidates on their campaigns. We are a nonpartisan organization. But if you are running a messaging campaign, it is our pleasure to advise you. It is our pleasure to advise you. All right, I think we might have time for one more question.
Thanks for that, Nathaniel. All right, I think I saved the best for last, because this asks, can you please go over how effective our phone banks are, even though we often get hangups and not home?
Really, really great question. So in that reports and studies tab that Ren shared, you should look for, I think it's called the Winter Spring 2022 mobilization study, or some mobilization report, because in there we actually have a randomized control trial that proves through phone calls alone, using the exact scripts that we are using, we were able to increase turnout in the Texas state primary last year. I believe it was 1.1 percentage points across the entirety of Texas among these low propensity environmental voters. So that is a proven impact. Now, to get to another part of the question that was asked, well, okay, maybe you have this proven impact, but like, oh my gosh, all these people hang up, or they do this, or they do that. Like, well, here's the interesting thing. What we have come to realize is that the power, the mobilization power in phone calls does not just come from the conversation that you have. Even if you don't have a conversation, there is still turnout power to it, simply as what's called a message delivery vehicle. So this is what I mean by like a conversation versus a message delivery vehicle. If a campaign sends direct mail, they're not having a conversation with you, right? There's no back and forth if you receive a piece of direct mail. You are just getting a message. It is a message delivery vehicle. Whereas if you're knocking on someone's door, hopefully you are having a back and forth with them. You're having a conversation with them. Well, what we have come to realize with our phone calls is, yes, there is real value in that back and forth, in that conversation, but there is also real value simply in delivering that initial script to people and then having them say, get lost, or wrong number, or not interested, and hanging up. Even when that happens, we can see in our data that we are increasing turnout among those people who say, get lost, wrong number, I don't want to talk to you. That alone is you increasing turnout from those people. And so, yeah, I know it's frustrating that sometimes people hang up, but what you are doing is you are still delivering a message to them, similar to as if you had sent them a piece of direct mail. You might not be having that perfect thing, which is a back and forth conversation with them, answering questions about how to vote early or where to go. Obviously, that's the best case scenario, but even the scenario where someone hangs up after 3 seconds is still actually increasing turnout among those people. And we know it from these studies. And so it is crucially important to call these people, especially the low propensity voters who we target at the Environmental Voter Project, because they are less likely to be contacted by campaigns. Think about it. If you are someone running a Suffolk County legislative campaign this fall, I promise you're not going to be spending a lot of time and effort talking to people who don't show up in odd year elections. And so oftentimes the call that you make to one of these people is the only touch they're ever going to get from anybody this fall. And so even if they hang up, that is a delivered message that is gold. And we see it in the data, and we have the receipts to prove it in that study that Ren shared with you. All right, We really want to respect your time. We went over by 1 minute. I'm sorry about that, but we'll get to the finish here. Please, you have a lot of links in the chat. Please take a moment before we close this Zoom to click on the Get Involved link to volunteer for one of these phone banks that we have coming up on Long Island. Please also take a moment, if you're so inclined, to donate to support our efforts. Not just over the next 3 months on Long Island, but over the next 15 months. My guess is many of you at some point in your life have said, my gosh, why don't these campaigns just work year round instead of waiting until the last possible minute to have everybody pile on these voters? That's what we do. That's what we do. These elections aren't going to get any coverage from CNN, but they are going to get coverage from us. And I promise you, if you are able to donate, you can donate at any amount. You can donate at $10, or you can donate 10,000. You can donate 10 million. And we can use it to turn these low propensity environmental voters into new voters and into consistent voters. And then the final ask is, if you would like to set up something for your group, either a briefing or a phone bank, please email us at info@environmentalvoter.org. And thank you. Thank you for caring about getting more people, and especially more environmentalists, to vote on Long Island. It is a pleasure and an honor to hopefully be doing this work with you. So thank you. Have a good night, everybody.